Next is Dan Fischer. Dan is a member and founder of Capitalism versus the Climate, an all-volunteer, horizontally run group based in Connecticut that takes direct action in solidarity with communities most impacted by the climate crisis. He's a graduate student of history at Southern Connecticut State University. His articles and video have been published on Mondo Ice, Counterpunch, Waging Nonviolence, Earth First, Palestine Chronicle, International Cry, and elsewhere. Dan Fischer.
All right, so my remarks are going to be about why environmentalists and climate activists should revive the peace movement. And I want to start in the summer of 2014 when Stan Heller and I had found out that Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy had invited his constituents to a hike at East Rock Park. And Stan and I decided to attend and ask him why on earth he had just voted to support a resolution greenlighting Israel's then ongoing slaughter of Palestinians. At that point in the slaughter, Israel had massacred 300 Gazans, and by the conflict's end in the summer of 2014, about 2,200 had died, 500 of them children. So we went to this hike, and Senator Murphy reached out his hand to shake Stan's hand, and Stan pulled away. And he said, "Why on earth did you vote for this resolution?" This resolution, by the way, passed unanimously in the Senate that summer, atrociously. And as I captured it on video, Senator Murphy did something remarkable. He denied any knowledge of this resolution. He said he'd never heard of it. We put the video up on Mondo Weiss with the fact that, and a link to this documented fact, that not only had Murphy heard of this resolution, he co-sponsored it. And yet was too ashamed to admit it. Anyway, a group of environmentalists and animal lovers were also on this hike. And they ignored Stan and I, and they ignored our concerns about Palestinians. They were only there to thank Senator Murphy for his support, which did deserve thanks, for legislation against a certain type of cruelty to horses. But the group published a Facebook photo album full of glowing language about the compassionate senator and his love of animals, and they made no mention in this Facebook photo album about Gaza, about Palestine, about the fact that there were people protesting Senator Murphy there. And it made me wonder, did they think that the bombs that Israel was dropping on hundreds and hundreds of Gazan children and other civilians somehow avoided all the animals or had no impact on the environment? And if so, they were wrong, because the Palestinian Environmental NGO Network reported that after the assault, residents in a third of Gaza's communities reported a loss of birds, of wild birds, and participants in Al-Shuka and Abasan El-Jadida reported losses in wild animals. These hikers, these environmentalists, they should have just read Theodor Herzl himself, right from the horse's mouth, the founder of the main current of Zionism, and he wrote in his 1896 book, The Jewish State, I quote, "Supposing, for example, we were obliged to clear a country of wild beasts, we would organize a large and active hunting party, drive the animals together, and throw a gelignite bomb in their midst." This is the logic, the ecocidal, earth-destroying logic of the warmongers. But again, such matters were unfortunately beyond these environmentalists' concern. And this is a really pervasive problem in the environmental movement. Too often they stick to a single-issue mindset, and it's disastrous. So, for instance, Conservation International, one of the largest global green groups, has worked closely with weapons manufacturer Northrop Grumman, helping them greenwash their image as they profit from the dropping of bombs from warplanes. And in 2011, undercover reporters met with a representative of Conservation International. They pretended to be weapons manufacturers themselves. They said, "Will you help us green our image?" And the Conservation International representative was more than happy to help. They said, "Hey, if you give us a donation, we'll help you join this Sustainability Council," which also included such eco-friendly companies as Shell, Chevron, and Monsanto. The League of Conservation Voters publishes a scorecard every year. grading the senators and the congressmen and women on their votes on the environment. And so I looked at the scorecard from this past year. Nothing about war, as if war had no impact on the environment. It was absurd. And maybe this mindset helps explain, although not totally, why on earth they decided to endorse the hawkish Hillary as early as November in the Democratic primary. Back in 2003, the Sierra Club, and I hate to pick on the Sierra Club because I really respect the grassroots members, but the national organization back in 2003 censored their local chapters, including the Glen Canyon Four, who tried to come out publicly as Sierra Club members against the Iraq War. And they said, no, that's not a Sierra Club issue, and it's atrocious. And so there's many reasons why Greens should oppose war, and I want to get into some of them. The first reason is that the U.S. military is the world's largest consumer of fossil fuels. And this is a widely known fact. I'll give you a few quotes. The Center for American Progress, the U.S. military is the largest single consumer of energy, meaning fossil fuel energy, and oil on the planet. The Union of Concerned Scientists say the U.S. military uses more oil than any other institution in the world. So why did the Sierra Club ignore this? Why does Conservation International ignore this? And so forth. The second reason is that these wars around the world are being fought in large part to secure the flow of fossil fuels. And I'll quote President Obama. He says in 2013 in a speech to the UN, he was ready to use all elements of our power, including military force, to secure core interests in the Middle East. Specifically, he promised to ensure the free flow of energy from the region to the world. But he wasn't saying anything new. He was just reiterating the Carter Doctrine, which said the same thing. U.S. military will do whatever they can to violently secure the flow of oil. And Alan Greenspan, of course, wrote in his autobiography, or his memoir, or whatever, he wrote, the Iraq war is largely about oil. So it's no secret, so why aren't Greens addressing it? The third reason is that the funds spent on war, and Ashley touched on this a bit earlier, would go a long way toward paying for not only social programs, but a transition to green energy. So the Harvard policy researcher Linda Blimes calculates the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq will cost all told a total of $4 billion to $6 trillion, I think, rather. Think about how much that would spend towards renewable energy. Fourth reason, wars have devastating local impacts to the environment. And Joshua Frank and Counterpunch recently penned a really moving piece about the tolls of the bombing in Afghanistan on wildlife such as gazelles and cheetahs and snow leopards. And he quotes Dr. Umad Hanid, who's a bird expert in Pakistan. He says that thousands and thousands of ducks and other birds used to fly over the border from Afghanistan to Pakistan. But then after the bombing started in 2001, they virtually disappeared. Fifth reason I want to mention is the ever-present danger of nuclear weapons and the threats that they pose. In 1955, Albert Einstein and Bertrand Russell published a manifesto that asked, shall we put an end to the human race, or shall mankind renounce war? And now that, according to the New York Times, President Obama has been at war longer than any president in U.S. history, that question is more important than ever. So that's something that environmentalists should address. And they are addressing at the grassroots level, in the more radical wing, the more grassroots wing of the movements. So, for instance, in the People's Climate March in 2014, I was struck that there was a block called the Free Palestine Block. I'm sure that some people here were marching in that. And I could have sworn there were as many signs saying Free Palestine as there were saying end fracking or end nuclear power. It was remarkable. At Wesleyan University, last spring, about 50 people occupied the president of the university's office. And they had three demands. They said Wesleyan must divest from the Israeli-occupied territories. Wesleyan must divest from fossil fuels. And Wesleyan must divest from private prisons. So here you have three different groups that together wouldn't have been able to pull off an occupation of the president's office, but together they did. And it was really remarkable. Just this last month, a group called the Fang Collective in Rhode Island decided to protest outside Texatron's headquarters in Providence. And these are environmentalists, and not Texatron, the Fang Collective are environmentalists. They said that it is disastrous, these cluster bombs that Texatron is using that are slaughtering people in Yemen, and Pia Ward was one of the three people protested, and she herself grew up in the the war in Lebanon in 1982, and said that we have to connect the issues of the environment and war. And so we're seeing at the grassroots level these connections being made, and it's promising. Ashley mentioned the mass marches against war 13 years ago. Well, just recently, the Break Free mobilization was the largest ever global civil disobedience, according to The Guardian. And 50 were arrested in Washington state for blocking the delivery of oil on trains. 1,000 people marched in the Philippines against a new coal plant. 1,000 protested against BP's refinery proposal in Chicago, and dozens were arrested. So imagine if the anti-war folks and the climate justice folks connected, and how powerful we could be. We could revive both movements at the same time. So I want to end with some lessons that I've learned from my participation in the climate movement and how we might apply them to the peace movement. Number one, direct action works, and I'm glad to see that the manifesto, or the draft statement rather, of the Revive the Peace Movement Network says that our main tools are education and nonviolent direct action. And that's very promising, because we saw direct action being so important in stopping the Keystone XL tar sands oil pipeline, right? That wouldn't have been stopped if over 1,000 people hadn't been arrested at the White House gates, if the Lakota people hadn't set up a spiritual camp stopping the construction on their territory, if people in Texas hadn't gone up and climbed into the trees and set up a tree camp for 88 days, stopping TransCanada's construction. This tactic works, and the peace movement needs to apply it. Number two, the insider strategy in Washington, D.C. in itself is a dead end. And the climate movement saw that when they tried to get everybody behind cap and trade, this U.S. cap alliance. And what they did was they said, okay, we'll make compromises, we'll back a legislation filled with loopholes and handouts for nuclear power and offshore drilling and so forth. And they got BP to join this coalition, and they got all these other energy companies to join the coalition. And it still didn't work. It's a dead end. We can't rely on the politicians themselves to solve this for us unless we put tons and tons of pressure on them. Number three, fear and lesser evilism and false solutions aren't going to motivate people. Principled and hopeful visions are. So in the climate movement, people aren't going to fill the streets, and people aren't going to fight for half measures and false solutions like carbon offsets or natural gas or nuclear power. But they will fill, as we found in Connecticut, a lecture hall to learn about how 100% green energy is possible. They'll turn out for the hopeful visions and the principled visions. Likewise, I don't think people are going to fill the streets to back dictators or false solutions, but I do contend that they will support popular struggles, and they'll turn out to support justice and peace in Palestine and Chiapas and Syria and Rojava and beyond. And the fourth and final lesson I want to share is that I think you can count.
She has written a number of books, including Drone Warfare, Killing by Remote Control, and has an upcoming book about Saudi Arabia. More than a writer and an advocate, she is an in-your-face direct activist, bravely and creatively speaking truth to power, whether to Saudi tyrants, the NRA, the Israel lobby, or the President of the United States. Medea Benjamin.
Well, with that intro, I'll start out with an anecdote, which is we have been protesting at Trump rallies pretty constantly, and Trump appearances, and also at Hillary Clinton ones. And one of the latest ones, we decided we would bring King Salman from Saudi Arabia in, because he is a great supporter of Hillary Clinton, having given at least $10 million to the Clinton Foundation. So we appeared at a Hillary fundraiser with my partner, Ty Barry, dressed as King Salman. And he, had the head cut out of King Salman and the money bags coming in. And he also brought with him a bloody head. And he kept dropping the head in the middle of the thing. So, I lost one of those heads that we just cut off the other day. And he said, he was coming to say, we're here to support the Hillary Clinton campaign because Clinton has been so good to Saudi Arabia. And it's just a way to connect some of these issues, because I do think that we're going to have either a Hillary Clinton presidency or a Trump presidency, And this is going to be the time to revive this moribund peace movement. And so the silver lining is that we have to revive it no matter who gets into this White House, because there are no illusions right now that whoever gets in is going to be a hawk and going to try to drive us deeper and deeper into the perpetual wars that we're already in. How do we move in that direction? Well, I thank Stan for all the work he's done to try to create this new coalition of groups. But I also want to disagree a little bit more with the premise and maybe with what Ashley said, because I want to pay tribute to other coalitions that have come before and are still trying to do the work of reviving. And one of those is United for Peace and Justice. And I see George Martin here, who's done so much work on that. And I wondered if I could just give you a moment to clarify what you think happened to
Well,
UFPJ.
thank you. And then Ashley, I appreciate concern, because UFPJ never had large donors. It was from us, 25 bucks and 10 bucks at a time. You know, the traditional disarmament movement didn't fund us in the beginning. It was the environmental movement that threw some money in to get us going. Okay, that's a reality. So with Obama's initial campaign, it took workers and it took money away from the peace movement. Not only UFPJ, AFSC had to sell half their buildings. Organizations throughout this country downsized. We went from 15 staff to 1. And it was a very hurting thing. And we realized that. And so there was a division within UFPJ. Should we continue doing what we're doing? Or should we step aside and let a new butterfly evolve that can better deal with this democratic militarism in the direction at that point in time? You know, as a black man, I'm proud we have a black president, but I was never in support of him, because I knew in Chicago that the Crown family, General Dynamics, had pushed his war chest and got him to D.C. So I was never there with that. But at the same time, I always go with my friends, and my friends who are supporting Bernie, I say, go with your hope. You know, but let's talk later, and now's the time to start that talk. But so in terms of what happened with UFPJ, there was that division. And many of us were of the ill to say, let's start all over again. We need a different structure. Well, the structure continued, and I support that. I'm not as active as I used to be. And and I'll get into some other things later on, but I think it's important to clarify that point. And thank you, Medea.
So thank you. And we have people here who represent the oldest peace movement in the United States, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and I want to give a shout out to them. I think Ashley did a great job at putting forth some reasons for the fall in the peace movement. There were others. The women's movement. The women's movement, for the most part, the establishment women's movement, supported the invasion of Afghanistan and continued to support U.S. presence in Afghanistan. And that made it very difficult for groups, especially groups like CODEPINK, that were trying to reach out and form a broader women's movement against the war. There were all kinds of reasons that led us into where we are today. And I would add another one, which is that we tend to eat each other up. We tend to say that we're not as radical as the next one, that if we supported Al Gore, we were the worst people in the world, that if we vote for Hillary Clinton, we are monsters, that if we think that, I mean, you can go on and on into the ways that we really destroy each other. And it doesn't make it very fun. It doesn't make it very inviting. It doesn't say to the enthusiastic young people like Dan, come on into this movement, it's a great big tent. And we got to stop doing that. So I think that this effort is one great effort. We still have the United for Peace and Justice folks. We still have UNAC. We have Win Without War, which some would say very mainstream. Well, you know what? It doesn't want war, so it should be part of the tent. You know what? There's libertarians like the Cato Institute. Hate all their social policies, that's fine. They don't like war. We need a big tent. And the only way we're going to grow a big tent, to grow a renewed peace movement at a time when it's still hard to even talk to people about war, they say, what war? And we'd have to say wars. And they'd say, what wars? And then they would say ISIS, and ISIS is terrible, so we've got to do something about ISIS. It's very hard to rebuild a movement when you don't have troops on the ground, because that was the lesson that was learned. We've got to be creative. And when we get creative, I think people like Dan are right on the money when you say you got to be part of other movements that have more energy right now. And one of them is the climate movement. And we will only be inviting if we stop trying to denounce the other one for not being more revolutionary or not being anti-war enough. Let's find the areas that we can agree with. So, looking for some of the areas we can agree with. We are torn apart on the issue of Syria. Absolutely torn apart. We have absolutely no good solution for what we say about Syria. We know what to say, or at least I know what to say. We want an arms embargo to the region. Not going to happen. We say that we want Turkey to stop cutting off the fighters coming in to people to joining ISIS. We want the borders to be sealed so that the oil that ISIS makes is cut off to them. I mean, these are things we say, but the reality on the ground is a much different one. Turkey, very complicated, has its own issues, more interested in fighting the Kurds than they are in fighting ISIS. It's a complicated situation right now. What can we find in common? Yes, it's true, the U.S. is paying a large percentage of the bills, but you know what? It caused a lot of the problem, and it's not paying enough. And it has more money that should be paid. When I see that only 23% of the humanitarian needs for the Syrian refugees are being met, I say we should give more money. And that can be a unifying call that we do. When we say that there's so few Syrian refugees that have been taken into the United States, and this deals with the Islamophobia and Trump's platform, that's something that we can unite and say no. When you look at Canada, and not only the numbers that they brought in, which is way above the numbers that this big United States has brought in, it is a unifying thing that makes Canadians feel proud of themselves when they get together as a community and say, we've now gotten 20 sponsors, we've gotten 80 people who've chipped in, we've now raised $50,000 for one refugee family, then they go to the government, and the government gives them a refugee family. And as a community, they are dealing and helping the family. That's beautiful. It brings community together. It's positive for everybody. Why can't we do that in the United States? How can we allow our government to say we're not bringing in these refugees that we helped create, and we've only brought in 1,300 in this huge country of ours? It's absolutely disgraceful, and that's something we could get together on. And no matter where we stand on the issue of Assad and ISIS, we could get together on those issues. The nuke issues, there is a group, and there are old peace groups and all kinds of groups that have worked on nuclear issues, but there is so much more that can unite us. With Obama going to Japan right in the next week to not have a big, massive call, not just online, but people out on the streets saying, you're going to Hiroshima and you're not going to apologize for the use of the nuclear bomb that killed hundreds of thousands of people, that's horrendous. And more important, looking towards the future, you're going to Japan and you're going to Hiroshima, and you're not going to say in these last months of office that you're going to stop this terrible $1 million modernization of our weapons program. I mean, we should be out in the streets about these kind of things, which is why we need this renewed peace movement. Other things we can get together on is Saudi Arabia. And, you know, as somebody who has worked a lot, raise your hand if you've worked on the Palestine issue. Well, that is one issue I think the peace movement is doing a fabulous job around, that we have scared the hell out of the Israelis with this boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. They don't know what to do about it now. They have come back in full force, especially on college campuses, attacking the Students for Justice in Palestine, and those students need our support, and it's going to be a knockdown, drag-out showdown this fall on campuses. We got to be there for them. But how many of you have also been said, why are you picking on Israel, and why did you look at some of those repressive Arab states and talk about their repressive actions? Well, I heard that so many times I finally decided to do something about it and started really looking into Saudi Arabia. So I'm going to hand out these cards, a book I have that's coming out very soon. and also hand out the sign-up sheet because we want to work with you on this as well as other issues. On Saudi Arabia, there are so many things to work on. We had a great Saudi summit. Some of you were there. And we came up with all kinds of things to work on, which we have started to do, everything from supporting political prisoners. We had a video we put out that reached over 1 million people in these last few weeks, including lots of people we're now in touch with inside Saudi Arabia, which is very exciting. We're working on the women's issues with Saudi women who are telling us where they want us to start this work. There are all kinds of think tanks and foundations that are getting Saudi money that we're starting to name and shame. So a lot of great work to be done on that. And the two last things I wanted to mention is, one is the issue of the budget. Joanne, you just did a great piece, and people should look it up, about what are the three, Bernie Sanders, Hillary, and Trump, their positions on foreign policy issues. And you look at...
I just so happen to have a few copies here.
It's excellent. So 2 copies and then the rest online. But you talk about Bernie Sanders and the budget. Bernie Sanders, back in 2002, said the military budget should be cut by 50%, which is what Jill Stein of the Green Party says. You ask Bernie Sanders now, he will waffle. He will not give out a number at all. And he just throws it out there, and he throws it, as Joanne said very clearly in her piece, about waste, fraud, and abuse kind of things, instead of getting at the core of it, which is the military interventions, the weapon systems themselves, like the F-35. Talk about making alliances with the student debt movement. You could say for the F-35 program, you could fund everybody's college education for the next 23 years, according to the National Priority Projects. So there is so much that needs to be cut, and Bernie, unfortunately, has not done a good job at educating people around that, because it is still a sacrosanct issue. In fact, the amendment that came up last week in Congress about cutting the military budget was calling for a cut of 1% in the military budget, and they could not get nearly enough votes to cut the military by 1%. The military budget is where we can have lots of allies, because it is robbing us from everything from a Medicare for all single-payer system to free college education that people deserve. It certainly is taking money that we need to build for the climate crisis that we are in. And I think also for people in the Black Lives Matter movement, we can talk about the connections between the militarization of our overseas program and the militarization of our police forces, and how we have to get the money out of things like the 1033 program that dumps U.S. weapons systems into our police forces. The divestment movement that you mentioned, Dan, we've got to add into that mix, divest from military contractors. We have to have a massive divestment movement from military contractors. The time is right for doing it. And I would just say the last thing that we have to do, because we know that whoever is going to be in the White House is going to be bad, we should anticipate that before November by having a anti-war gathering somewhere in the United States that brings the different factions together, that says that we want the big tent, that brings people from the climate movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, from all these movements that we want to make connections with, and start strategizing together with large numbers of people about how we're going to take on the next administration.